Hey folks, David Stewart here. Over the last few days, there's been some news that has come out regarding World of Warcraft Classic, Vanilla WoW, if you will, from Blizzard Entertainment, their version of Classic WoW. And I'm going to link the blog post down below so you can check it out and read everything that you want to there. There's three big takeaways that I wanted to talk about for my friends who like Classic WoW or Vanilla WoW. And those three big takeaways are patch 1.12. That is the patch that they are going to be presenting as their version of Classic. I think that's fairly certain at this point. And then two other kind of technical things that I think are also important to talk about. Mainly that they're going to be using some sort of custom client, and they're going to be using some sort of custom server software to deliver this Classic WoW experience. I'm going to start with the technical stuff. So they basically hinted that they are going to be using some version of the client software that is different from the 1.12 client software that has been circulating around the internet now for like a decade. And they're also going to be using some sort of custom server software rather than using, the classic server software or the exact client from when patch 1.12 was live. And I think they have some good reasons for doing that. The first and most important reason is they've implemented a whole bunch of things since then that prevent botting and cheating. And so they have said that they really want to have an experience that's not full of cheaters and botters. And if you remember Classic WoW, if you were around for the early days, all the way up through Wrath of the Lich King, botting and cheating was a major problem. You had people running WoW Glider and all kinds of other bot programs to just level their characters up. You had people using the hacks of the client software to teleport around the map or to travel underneath the map and like mine all the various metals out of a particular zone without ever getting into combat or having to fight something. You had a lot of these issues back in the day, so being able to present a version of WoW that doesn't include those negatives, I think, might be a priority given the quality of the other experiences on the Blizzard platform. So having a more modern server software is going to allow you to do that, and they've said that there's some problems with that because they've changed the format of the way they interpret their data tables over the years. So there has to be some sort of conversion that happens, and basically there's a bunch of data that's stored that has like scripting information, how mobs are going to act, and how much HP they have that the server software manages between thousands of clients. So a modern version of the software will be able to handle it more efficiently. Of course, there's newer updated hardware, which they haven't really talked about in this particular announcement, but I can talk about briefly, is that as you get better hardware, you end up with bigger servers, and that's a little bit different than what the Classic experience delivered way back in 2006 or whenever you played on the really crappy hardware where you can only have so many people online at a time. It's a different experience when you can have 30,000 people online at a server instead of just 6,000 or 7,000. They haven't really talked about that yet, but that'll be an issue that may be discussed perhaps in the future. So I could see the reasons for doing that. Now, that might also entail that you need a custom client to interpret what's going on because you're using a different server software. You may need a different client to interact with it. But also, they've said that they wanted more full integration with, with the Battle.net services, Real ID, things like that. Being able to chat with people in other Blizzard programs while you're playing, maybe chat with somebody in Live WoW while you're playing Classic WoW. I don't really see that as impossible given how most modern people play, which is to say you could have the Blizzard window open in like another monitor or tab it open or something like that, but I can see why they maybe want to integrate that, as well as being able to integrate it with their modern customer service setup, because back in the day you'd petition a GM on a specific server. It just all worked differently back then, so having an interface that actually interacts properly with their modern setup is probably going to be a good thing. Now, the bad thing about both of those things, is that you may be looking at a modern client like the Live WoW client reading or playing Classic WoW on it, and you have to question what that's going to look like, because the Classic client, and I've used the Classic client on modern hardware, I've never had a problem with it. They say that while they were playing it, the Classic client had problems recognizing modern video cards, and I've talked to people who've had some difficulty with that. But Anti-aliasing is different in the modern client, and by different I really mean worse. To me, I have a big nostalgic attachment to that full screen glow effect from classic WoW when I see it and the screen kind of glows, and it glowed differently on different kinds of video cards. And I used to play on like a G4 Mac way back in the day when I first started playing, and so the full screen glow effect, it just has never looked the same since then, but it's there, you know. So the way the way the world looked to me was kind of integrated into that client. And so if you look at a modern client, it may have increased view distances that make the game look a little wonky, considering all the terrain was designed with shorter draw distances in mind. You could be looking at something that's very not a classic experience if they go with a client that allows you to, or if they go with just the modern WoW client playing classic WoW maps and classic WoW mobs. It could be not very true to the original experience. So that's a little bit of a worry for me. But I understand why they may want to do it. Eliminating the cheating, I can see a lot of people not wanting cheating. And although everybody's very nostalgic for classic WoW, I think most people would be okay without really long server queues, which is what I had to deal with, and intense lag, which a lot of people had to deal with. There was times when the servers would crash, lag out. The server would crash, instant server would crash, the Calendar server would crash, all this kind of stuff would happen. I think most people are nostalgic for the way the game played, not the way the game didn't play, not the way it didn't function. So I can understand wanting to set your experience up so that you don't have the negatives that existed back then. So that's the technical stuff. Let's talk about the biggest one, which is that they're going to be releasing this game on the 1.12 patch, and it's all interrelated. The 1.12 patch was the last patch before the 2.0 pre-Burning Crusade patch, and since then they've set up this system where before they actually release expansion content, they release like a next version 0.0 patch that introduces the new talents and stuff like this. So 1.12 is the final version of classic WoW. That was Naxxramas was released and available for play. Everything was in its final state before they did that 2.0 pre-Burning Crusade patch. And this is the patch that most private servers run on, even if not all the instances are available. They run this patch in terms of the talents, the way the spells work, what dungeons are open most of the time. So in some, a lot of private servers are, Naxxramas hasn't been around on private servers that long because you have to script it all from scratch. You don't have that original scripting information. You have a dev team that has to essentially rebuild the instance from scratch on the server side. So with that in mind, when Blizzard releases patch 1.12, this probably means Naxxramas will be open, and so will everything else. There's some negatives with this. So let me talk about the negatives first. And the negatives are, patch 1.12 was the easiest patch in terms of what it allowed you to do as a player in terms of accessing content and doing the most damage, doing the most healing, all that kind of stuff. The 1.12 talents were the best version of talents for virtually every spec and every class prior to Burning Crusade. So that was the patch where most specs of most classes had some kind of viability, even if it was kind of a niche viability within a raid. There was something to do with every single spec. They had figured out how to fix the specs. Like, talents changed a lot in vanilla, and some trees were just dead when the game was launched and finally became kind of okay, like the Moonkin tree by the time that you got to patch 1.12. So the talents are better, which means classes that were really bad early in the game are finally good. And while that makes it more fun to play regardless of your class, that also makes the content easier than it was in the early versions of the patches. So warlocks were kind of notoriously bad DPS early on in vanilla. In fact, I had a friend who quit WoW because of how bad his warlock was. That it felt like useless, and he came back once they buffed warlocks. So you have buffed warlocks, you have all these other classes and specs that are buffed as well, which means the damage of the raid goes up just because it's in patch 1.12. compared to, say, patch 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, these earlier patches where the talents weren't quite figured out, the balance changes hadn't happened, and Blizzard tends to balance things with buffs more than nerfs. So patch 1.12, you have the strongest talent arrangement and the most ways to deal with problems. You also, since you would have all the instances open, you have the easiest pre-raid gearing arrangement. When you have AQ20 open and you have ZG open and you have Molten Core open and you have Dire Maul open, you have so many more ways to gear yourself out at 60 to do serious raiding than you did back when the game was very, very first released. And that also nerfs the game pretty significantly at the end game. The first time people walked into Molten Core and they didn't have any gear, they were wearing like greens and blues, that first pull of those 2 Molten Giants would wipe 40-man raids. Now, of course, part of that is that people didn't know how to play, and I'll get to that in a second. But now, before that raid walks in, you have gear you can get from Dire Maul that's better than a lot of the gear in Molten Core, and certainly better than the gear you would get in like BRD and Blackrock Spire and a lot of the Scholomance, a lot of the what was in game when the game was released, which were, Scholomance was like a 10 or 15-man raid initially. Ubers was a 15-man raid, and they nerfed that and made that easier. But Dire Maul had some great gear in it. So you're going to walk in with Dire Maul gear that's better. You're going to walk in with ZG gear that's better. You're going to walk in with AQ20 blues, which are better than those and even better than tier 1 in a lot of specific cases. That's just going to make Molten Core a lot easier to push through and clear and just completely kind of face roll over because you have all of that gear compared to when Molten Core was new. So you have the talent buff and you have the gear buff going. You also have the dungeon set, the tier 0.5 set available. All those quests where you get the dungeon set out of all the in-game dungeons, and then you go do some quests and pay some gold and upgrade them, and half of them would be epic. That's a huge buff to pre-raid damage. If you also have all the battlegrounds open, you have Grand Marshal gear available. A lot of that was just so good, so much better than what was available when the game first launched before Alterac Valley existed. People forget that Battlegrounds didn't exist when the game first came out. Those were added a little bit later on. So that's going to make it easier. Then you have this other thing. I'm just going to bring this in. This doesn't have to do with their announcement, but the game is going to be easier than people remember, and that's partly because people actually know how to play. They know the fights, and they have better talents than when they first stepped into Molten Core. They have better gear than when they first stepped into Molten Core back in the day, so it's going to end up being a little bit easier experience, at least until you get up to Naxxramas. And once you get to Naxxramas, you're going to be dealing with pretty much a par experience to what you dealt with originally, with the buff that you actually know the fights at that point. When people were pushing the content back in vanilla, there were no guilds that were doing like PTR stuff and then posting exactly how to do the fights. Like, you had to learn essentially through trial and error how the fight worked, and these major progression type guilds, they would be really like spend nights and nights wiping to figure out the fights, and then people would kind of leech off of them to figure out how to do what was there. So since you know how to do the fights, Naxxramas will be cleared a little bit more quickly than what it was live. So there's a lot of things that are going to end up making it easier, and those are the big ones. Now, the other thing about having patch 1.12, the fact that they said, here's patch 1.12, I understand why they're doing it. And it's because managing patch progression would do two things. First of all, it'd be really hard. It'd be really hard because you'd have to update client all the time. You'd have to update the server all the time to match all the little changes that you made. If you wanted it to flow just like it did in vanilla, if you're trying to recreate the exact experience of playing at launch all the way up to the release of Naxxramas, that would be very, very annoying for a development team to deal with. However, there's more to it than that, because you may be dealing with people coming in to play the game, and frankly, at launch, the game was not nearly as good as it was in patch 1.12. They made a lot of improvements. There's been a lot of improvements since then as well. Some quote quality of life improvements, I think have had the opposite effect. They've made the game worse. But people are coming in, if they come in and their class is really bad or talents are really bad and there's like dead specs and stuff like there was when the game was first launched, then you might be dealing with customer dissatisfaction. The game is not as high a quality as it could be. So you really want people who are stepping into this wanting to try it out to have an experience that's pretty fun. And frankly, the 1.12 experience for most people when it comes to leveling, getting gear, getting into raids, and going through the raid progression, it's a great snapshot of what was available in vanilla. I think of all the expansions, the final patch for vanilla, the final patch for classic WoW, the original version of World of Warcraft, is the best final patch that you can have and still maintain almost all of the total vanilla experience when it comes to how you interact with the content, how you level up, how you gear up and go through the raids. That one preserves it the best, and we could see that on private servers, and private servers have that experience to a great degree. Is it going to be exactly like it? No, but there's many things that are going to prevent it from being exactly like how it used to be. So that 1.12 patch, it's still a great snapshot in my opinion. This is different from if you were to do the last patch of Burning Crusade with like Isle of Kel'Donis open and all of that, all of the Badge of Justice gear from the final patch available for purchase. That would absolutely ruin the Burning Crusade experience. They started implementing these catch-up mechanics and these catch-up pieces of gear in about halfway through Burning Crusade, and I respect their decision to do that because you want people to feel like they can get enough gear to play with friends and advance quickly and catch up to people with a little bit of effort. But if you had that all available right when the game launched, there'd be no reason to do Karazhan except to just go get a bunch of Badges of Justice and then buy the best possible gear, skip TK and SSC, and just jump into Black Temple. So that would ruin the progression experience. It would ruin the Burning Crusade experience. But the 1.12 stuff, even though you have Dire Maul available, Dire Maul gear, it's still not really as good as Molten Core gear in most cases. The Tier 0.5 stuff, it's still not really as good as Tier 1. And ZG gear is comparable to Tier 1, but it's not like better than Blackwing Lair gear or anything like that. So you're still going to get the feeling that you got to go do dungeons, you got to do some 20-man raids and stuff, get some gear, then you can start getting Molten Core Blackwing Lair gear, killing Onyxia. All the attunements are still there, the epic attunement quests are still there, and by the time you get to Nax, you're going to have that, what's going to be pretty close to the authentic Nax experience, with the exception that you already know the fight. So I actually respect them doing this 1.12 patch. It'd be nice to have a patch progression kind of thing, but this signals to me that they're looking at it like, we're going to present the classic version of WoW, and we're not going to mess with what content is there. And that to me is a big positive. The fact that they are starting with 1.12 means they're not thinking outside of just, here's what it was, here's what the game was, it's a great snapshot of it. Everything that was available in Classic is available in patch 1.12. All the quests, all the dungeons, all the raids. Go do them, go have fun. What would be nice in the future, and maybe they can think about this looking at the EverQuest experiences, have progression servers. And if you're not familiar with how EverQuest progression servers worked, you would progress through not just patches but expansions. And the server would move from one patch or one expansion to the next based on, either the server voting on it or a certain number of guilds or a certain number of kills of the final boss of that expansion would happen. Then they'd unlock the next expansion and you'd move on and do it like that. I would love to see them open up some sort of progression World of Warcraft experience where you unlocked each instance, even if you were using patch 1.12 talents. There's some private servers that do this. They'll unlock the instances one at a time, either based on a condition or just it's timed, and then you get through to Naxxramas and people decide, okay, we've done enough Nax, open up Burning Crusade, our characters go off and do Burning Crusade progression and that kind of stuff. That might be something that I would love to see. I would love to see it somewhere down the line. Even if I don't get to fully participate in it, I think it's a great thing, especially if people missed that early progression experience. It was a really exciting and challenging thing to try to push yourself through a really hard instance, and wait around for that next one, and try to be really geared so that you can finish this, finish TK and be ready for Black Temple. And so few people were actually able to finish TK and SSC before Black Temple came out. It was a great experience in Burning Crusade, and it was a cool experience in vanilla as well. But in vanilla, it was kind of the Wild West of MMOs. You were just kind of flying by the seat of your pants. Blizzard made plenty of mistakes and timed things off and that sort of stuff. So I think the 1.12 patch is a great snapshot. I think a lot of people might like progression, but if you just want to see what Classic was about, that's the patch, man. Everything's good. Everything's balanced. You can play almost any spec and have a good time. And the gear's all there. There's a huge diversity of gear for you to figure out how you want to gear your character. If you want to do some wacky, weird spec, or you just want to play like healing druid, gearing yourself to be a feral druid at level 60 was quite a challenge, but you could do it. And certainly in patch 1.12 there was enough gear out there from all the different instances that it was possible. It was actually possible to do that. So thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what you want to see in here down below. Let me know what you think about this announcement with the Classic WoW stuff, and any kind of fears you might have, or any kind of positive thoughts. Generally, I think this is a positive thing. Also, that they're just telling us that they're doing something with Classic WoW. It's not like rotting on the vine. I expect it to come out, 2019 is when I would expect them to actually be able to release this. Stop and think about it. That's not that far off. So have a great night. I'll see you guys next time.